Liar. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Tuesday, March 16th, 2021, and how's it going for you? I'll tell you how it's going for me. Prior to the show, just prior to the start of our show, I got a call that, it gives me something to talk about on tomorrow's show when Greg returns. The latest information on my COVID vaccine, as you may recall, because I got the Pfizer vaccine and Greg got the Moderna vaccine. Is there a magazine? Maybe there is. I should subscribe to it because we thought that though he would have gotten his first shot first, he would end up getting his second shot after me because of the spacing on the Moderna vaccine, according to Moderna magazine. Modern Moderna magazine says this. However, as it turns out, that's not the way it's going to work out because I got a great call from the Loudoun County Health Board, or I don't know what they call them, but the health department telling me that for purposes of efficiency, this was really interesting, to make the operation more efficient, my second vaccine dose was going to be canceled. So that seems super efficient. I guess it really was because they were closing on certain dates, and I guess they decided that it was not efficient for them to remain open on Saturdays for the dose. And I thought, what a great day to go and get the vaccine. I'll be free all day, and I don't have to schedule time away from work or anything else, and neither will anyone else who gets their vaccine on Saturday. But I guess they decided that was not going to work, so now I'm rescheduled for just to double check with everybody else who's rescheduling vaccines. Friday the 16th at 3:50 p.m., which seems like a end of the day rush, and probably the most likely to be canceled again as well. I don't know, but all right. Well, so that's that. So that's going to be real interesting. So I don't think that does anything. I asked when I got the vaccine the first time, does it matter if I'm a couple days late for the second dose? It doesn't really. I had heard that it didn't really matter. And I guess really the only issue is they don't want you to have it any sooner. And I guess there's probably an outside window after which they would prefer, they would say, well, that was a little too late. But I think a couple days is going to turn into, what, like 12 days later than I originally anticipated. So, okay, that's 12 days later to my 85% immunity or whatever it is or efficacy, however it is I'm supposed to express it. And gee whiz, I don't know. I mean, I guess that means that there weren't nearly as many people signing up for Saturday vaccines as there were for weekday vaccines. And maybe that's why they ended up closing, or they were, only booking at half capacity on Saturdays. But, well, that throws my schedule off somewhat. Gosh, I wish that had not happened, because also, of course, my mom is considering a visit now that she's vaccinated, and she thought, oh, well, by mid-April, mid to late April, you'll be fully vaccinated and all of the effects will have set in. But now, as it turns out, I will not have that in place. But I think I might have the second vaccine in place before she shows up anyway. So that's got to be worth something. Anyway, annoying truth about, I guess about having I don't know. Maybe you think this is a symptom of having the one giant vaccination center versus a bunch of smaller clinics. I'm not sure, but anyway, there's probably a couple hundred people out there just like me finding that their Saturday appointments are being canceled when they were so looking forward to them. And I've been trying to schedule them for the end of the week in anticipation of any reactions to the second shot, which I've found in my family anyway has been the case with reactions anyway to the Moderna shot, and I assume probably to both, but maybe it has something to do with the timing, maybe it doesn't, maybe it's just a thing that's to be personal to them, but I thought maybe among family members you might expect the same. So I thought I would schedule it for the end of the week when I wouldn't have to deal with symptoms during the workday. But of course, what would be the point of that? Greater efficiency? Well, you can't have any of that. That's up to the county. So anyway, there we are. And that's where things stand at the moment. Not relevant to your life, per se, but it's on my mind. Anyway, now we're ready to roll with the rest of the show that's relevant to the entire country and the entire world. Bill knows it and tweets about it from Portland, Maine. The Kagro in the Morning radio show is live now, although for some reason, he typed it funny, and it says Schradio show. It doesn't really. It's just the way I pronounced it. But, we're live. And the number 2 ranking senator now says the filibuster needs to wipe that smirk off its face. This is true. Kagro X, me, David Waldman, may talk about this today, and I think so, along with other stuff, and there's even time for probably other stuff as well. We're really on the ball here. I'm giving Bill so much to work with in my morning posts, which reminds me that yesterday morning's post, I was so proud of myself for having cited all the things on my NAFTA refrigerator calendar and brought up the fact that it was Benito Juarez's birthday observation and the beginning of Eastern Orthodox Lent. And I told you all this on the radio and stuff. But it turns out that I had scheduled my morning post for the evening, 8:45 p.m. somehow. And so it didn't run yesterday morning, and then I thought, well, what's the point of running it in the afternoon? The show's no longer on live, so we'll skip it, and all my good Eastern Orthodox Lent and Benito Juarez birthday material went down the tubes, but at least I got to use it on the radio. So now we proceed with other things. As he mentions, the filibuster, much in the news these days, and definitely going to have to make a stop and talk about that. Let's see. We have, we already have a response about that. Dave R says, for Moderna second shots, 28 to 42 days optimum. I got Pfizer, though, so I don't know what's optimum for Pfizer. I was just looking out I was more worried about the reaction to the shots than anything else. But anyway, the rest of my family got Moderna. I got Pfizer, not by choice. That's just what they were giving out this day. Second shot, he says, not that weird in his case, so that's good. My couple family members got, they were really sore and they got sweats and chills and all sort, mild fever and all that. So I guess I'm looking out for that. I don't know whether, like I said, I don't know whether that's going to be more determined by genetics or more determined by which vaccine. I doubt very much whether it has anything to do with the spacing of the doses, but who knows. Anyway, I'm all in for that. Doesn't really matter. I'm prepared for it, and I'm going to get that vaccine. Anticipate not feeling all that well the next day. And if it works out where I feel okay, great. If it works out where I feel lousy, I'll say, terrific. I got a Friday vaccine, and it's ruining my Saturday. But the point would be it won't ruin your Saturday. It would never ruin your Saturday because my show's not on. But I was anticipating, a Thursday or Friday show where I was like, I'm too sick, I can't do it, and you'll have to listen to a rerun. All right, so we won't have that, but we will have reruns with respect to the content, because we'll be talking about the filibuster, no doubt. There is some news, and I set it aside. I saw it yesterday, but I didn't set it aside. Now I did set it aside because, I don't know, I saw it again, and I said, I forgot to set that aside last time. This time it is Sam Stein, whose other tweet from the other day I didn't set aside, but did hunt down for the roundup. This time noting things are moving. What's moving? It is sentiment on the filibuster. It includes a couple of screenshots. One from, January 2018. Durbin warns against Senate, quote, nuclear option to reopen the government, at least specifically in that case. But this is meant to demonstrate Durbin's prior resistance to use of the nuclear option to make any further changes to filibuster rules. It's a little bit unfair given that the 2013 headlines would have said Durbin just fine with the nuclear option and totally uses it. So he's been back and forth. But I guess here this is to illustrate that it's not something that he's coming to lightly or casually. So let's see, January 2018, didn't want to use it to reopen the government. Then, let's see, August 2020, Durbin leaning to vote to abolish the filibuster should Dems retake control of the Senate. Then up January 24th of this year, Dick Durbin calls absolute protection of Senate filibuster a non-starter. And I guess finally finishing up with yesterday's headline, Durbin, the time is now for filibuster reform. So, okay, I like that. That's a well-constructed progression from Sam from no, we're not going to be using that again to, well, we should be open to it to, this could be the time to, this is the time. So yesterday I saw the news that Durbin had given a floor speech in which, I don't know, one or another of the great Capitol Hill reporters, who knows, S.V. Date comes to mind. I don't know. It could have been him. Could have been another person. I'll find it. Saying that he was giving a speech absolutely excoriating the filibuster. Seems like good news. And I guess this is coverage of that speech. Durbin, the time is now for filibuster reform. Beginning with the quote, I support discussing any proposal that ends the misuse of the filibuster as a weapon of mass obstruction. Get it? In a floor speech in a speech on the Senate floor, U.S. Senate Majority Whip Dick Durbin today voiced his support for reform of the filibuster and called on his colleagues to join him in this effort. Durbin argued that there are many options of reform worth considering, really should be for reform, including the standing filibuster, or what they were calling the talking filibuster a little while ago. And this, I don't even know where this is coming from now that I think about it, but I'm reading the screenshot that's included in Sam Stein's tweet, but obviously someone's news account of it, with some quotes from his floor speech. Today, nearly 65 years after Strom Thurmond's marathon defense of Jim Crow, the filibuster is still making a mockery of American democracy. Roar! That part, I added the roar. Okay. The filibuster is still being misused by some senators to block legislation urgently needed and supported by strong majorities of the American people, Durbin said. This is what hitting legislative rock bottom looks like. Today's filibusters have turned the world's most deliberative body into one of the world's, I was going to say least effectual, but he says most ineffectual bodies. Durbin continued, I have been long open to changing the Senate's rules to restore the standing filibuster. If a senator insists on blocking the will of the Senate, he or she should have to pay some minimal price of being present. No more phoning it in. If your principles are that important, stand up for them, speak your mind, hold the floor, and show your resolve. I support discussing any proposal that ends the misuse of the filibuster as a weapon of mass obstruction. If the Senate retains the filibuster, we must change the rules so that a senator who wants to bring our government to a standstill endures at least some discomfort in the process. We need new rules that actually promote debate. And I think a widely held opinion at that point. That brings me back to Pocket to dig up. I don't know if I ever really actually used this thing on the air, but I've been holding on, I think, for quite a while now to a tweet that, no, maybe we did use it eventually, but, and if we did, good. What was it? It was that I had held on for a long time to, and now that I recall, I think we probably did bring it up on the air at some point, the evolution of Bernie Sanders on the subject of filibuster reform and the use of the nuclear option to change it in particular, that he too had gone through a similar thought process. And no mystery there. It was essentially the conclusion of the Senate Democratic Caucus at that point, that the majority agreed either at first that the nuclear option was something they didn't want to consider using, or that it shouldn't be used for this thing. Then, of course, they all agreed briefly in 2013 to use it for eliminating the filibuster on nominations. then back to resistance to it. And from that point, a slow evolution for everybody. And Bernie Sanders went through the same thing. So, all right. Well, we did, I guess, eventually get around to sharing that. So that's good news. Glad I did it. Too bad I can't remember it. It was probably great, though, wasn't it? Okay. Well, let's see. Other items for consideration today. There are several. And as a matter of fact, maybe while we're on the subject, we could just start in on some of these things now. As I mentioned, I got a couple of installments from Rich, our friend who writes at Daily Kos under the name of Liberal Thinking, who has taken up consideration of filibuster reform as well. And I listened to a couple of the first installments and edited them lightly, cleaned them up so that he sounds his best. And, I thought I would roll them because they're great backgrounders. Again, mostly I would say probably for those who have not spent a great deal of time thinking about filibuster reform or are perhaps new to the show. Certainly stuff that we've discussed, but also I just thought it was a good basis for starting the discussion on the subject. Although I am thinking perhaps we come back to it. Maybe we'll come back to it a little bit later before Joan visits the show. I don't know whether it's going to be something that she's going to necessarily want to. I think we mentioned it last week that it was likely we would spend some time on it. Maybe it's a better build up to that. But I think you'll find that these segments are good launching points for discussion, sometimes for a little bit of pushback, sometimes for a little bit of speculation about what sorts of changes might be made, and probably worth our time. But now I'm thinking there's a couple of things I wanted to bring up that were more immediate in the news, even more so than filibuster reform, which is sort of an ongoing thing. But when we do get around to filibuster reform, I guess I'll say this: if you do happen to be new to the show, and or to the subject of filibuster reform, I'll simply make this. I'll have to do this a couple of times, I think, over the next couple of weeks, just reminding everybody about this. If you are convinced of the fact that the Senate can change the application of its rules on the filibuster by majority vote, that they need to simply round up the 50 votes, get Sinema and Manchin on board, make their move, vote together, perhaps using the tie-breaking vote of Vice President Harris to finish the work. If you believe that that's something that the Senate can do to change its filibuster rules, you're welcome. And I'm glad I taught you that that was the case. You might not have known. I mean, longtime listeners will probably know that. Longtime readers of Daily Kos might know that. But there's a significant portion of the country running around certain, for some reason, that this is something that you can actually do. And I'll tell you this, 15 years ago, that was not the case. 10 years ago, I don't even know if that was necessarily the case with everybody. Where were we 10 years ago? Yeah, about 2011. People were coming to that realization. Certainly 2013 woke them up to it eventually because they got to witness it happen. But 15 years ago, if you wrote at Daily Kos or anywhere else, or said on a radio show, or mentioned at a coffee shop, like a hipster coffee shop where the right-wing people go to find out what the secret plans of left-wing people are, that the Senate should change its filibuster rules, you'd probably get a lot of agreement. But of course, somebody would say, but you need 67 votes to break a filibuster on a proposal to change the rules. It's not going to happen. It can't be done. And if you said, no, it actually can be done. I know everybody thinks that you need 67 votes to break a filibuster to change the rules. Very few people actually knew that anyway. They probably thought it was 60 votes. It was worse. It was 67. But said, there's a way of changing the way the rules operate without actually changing the rules. Rather, you would be setting a new precedent. And guess what? It can be done with a simple majority vote. If you just set the vote up right and count your votes ahead of time so that you know what's going to happen, you can do it. And if you said that to most people, they that doesn't sound right. I don't know where you heard that. I read it on the internet is not going to fly. Even then, we knew that wasn't really going to work with people. But if you said it to a reporter or a senator or a staffer, even the senators and staffers who had actually done it before, and there were a few at the time, they would simply say, no, yeah, that's so cute, little boy. You don't understand. Pat you on the head and say, you don't know how things really work. That's not how it really is. We reporters, we senators, we staffers, we various smart people, law professors, etc., know how it actually works. It says it right here in the rules, 67. Well, it says 2/3. But this was just not a thing that could be done, and well, it was, and it always has been, and it's been done before, and even more to the point, it had been written about at great length by some legal scholars who actually, I think, at the time thought that they were justifying the use of the nuclear option, which they termed the constitutional option to make it sound less scary. I think they were framing it, at least one of them was an actual Republican operative, and they were framing it to put it in a legitimate light for Republicans to use it on judicial nominations. And it was the sometimes infamous Gang of 14 agreement, if anybody remembers it, that defused this thing in about 2005. But by 2013, yeah, the shoe was on the other foot. The roles had reversed. The crisis was upon us again. And Democrats went ahead and used the thing. And, of course, Republicans threatened in the lead up to it. Well, you'll be sorry. We'll show you. There's going to be retribution, etc. You're going to have to pay the price for threatening us this way, which was remarkable, if only because nobody bothered to write, well, it's weird because you threatened us with this thing, and this is the actual payback for your threats, not the other way around. You don't get to pay us back for this. We're paying you. This is payback to you making this threat in 2005 and getting 99% of the judges you wanted out of it without even actually having to do the dirty work. Anyway, so there you have it. That they had forgotten that had happened. They had forgotten that the justification had been laid out because it hadn't been used. All I did was remind people that this was out there, that the Republicans had developed it into an article form anyway, and approved of it at the time and lined up most of their senators behind it and said it was okay. And here they were, of course, in 2013, now on the other side of it, and accusing Democrats of hypocrisy for having opposed it in 2005, but being for it in 2013, without anybody, except me, I guess, noting the hypocrisy of having proposed it in 2005 and then opposing it in 2013. It was like there were this magic elixir there. Whatever happens, the Republicans are right about this. And as reporters, we're just going to report it that way. But anyway, for years on end, I would tell people that this was not the case, that you had to have 67 votes to change the rules. That was never the case. It was just the filibuster part of it. Of course, that was technically wrong. But they just would look at you like you were crazy. And now everybody just writes openly that, yeah, of course this thing can be done with 50 votes. And it can be. And it's been done twice now in recent memory. And you're welcome for it. And isn't that interesting? If you had no idea how that idea got in your head, the answer is not that I made it up, but that I told you about it. And it was Martin Gold, and who's the first name of the other author of the piece? Gold and Gupta. I remember their last names because there was alliteration involved. But let's see, Martin Gold. Let me put in Gupta's last name here and get you the right names. There was their article that brought this to my attention. Here it is, Martin Gold and Dimple Gupta. And it was a 2004 piece. And again, even they didn't invent it. It was basically a restatement and re-explanation of the maneuver that made the 1975 filibuster rules changes possible. the one that brought it down from 2/3 of those present and voting for all filibusters to end by cloture, down to 3/5 for everything except rules changes, but it was 3/5 of those duly chosen and sworn. You remember that whole controversy. So, yeah, I mean, credit where it's due. Martin Gold and Dimple Gupta put that together and moved the Republicans in the Senate in 2004 and 2005 to realize that they had always had this power, but they were never able to get them to execute it. But thanks for leaving it out there so that I could use it in 2013 and the years running up to it to convince Democratic senators that the possibility existed. And then once they were convinced that it could be done and spoke to the press and told them that they could do it in preparation for the 2013 change, everyone was ready. And now the country believes that that's something that can be done maybe a little bit more liberally than even senators believe to be the case. But there you go. We put about, 10 years into making people believe that that could happen. And then it did happen. And then we put another 10 years into making them believe that they could and should do it for legislation instead. All right. So we can discuss that and I guess roll some of what Rich has got to add to the conversation and mull it over when we return from the break. But before we do that, well, first of all, we'll take the break. But then after we return from the break, but before we get into that, a couple of other news items involving, action in the Senate in terms of some of our Senate leaders coming to the realization that the new state of affairs under the Biden administration affords us opportunities to clean up a lot of messes, not just the filibuster. We'll get to that right after this. Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. I got a few more items to put aside for later in the day, week, year, month, whatever it turns out to be. And then keep channels open for new stories. Joan has let me know what's on her mind so that we've got a Politico article on tap for you, not about the nuclear option or the changing of the filibuster rules, but about something we've done a good job looking out for notes from others of you out there saying, hey, you know what really needs some attention is XYZ. We'll get to that one, what the XYZ actually is. But good suggestion, and we took it up and updated you because I figured this would come back to haunt us at some point, and so it has, and we'll talk about it, this mystery topic later on with Joan. But here's what I grabbed for you from this morning's headlines, besides Sam Stein's roundup of Durbin's evolution on the nuclear option, or at least on the question of when to use it. This was a good one. How about this news from The Guardian? I was wondering if we would get a peek at this at some point. FBI facing allegation that its 2018 background check of Brett Kavanaugh was, quote here, fake. How about that? A Democratic senator has asked Attorney General Merrick Garland, remember he is now the Attorney General, to facilitate proper oversight, that's a quote there too, proper oversight into concerns on the investigation. This is pretty interesting. Who wrote this for The Guardian? Stephanie Kirsch-Gassner. Gassner? We'll say Gassner, Gaessner, but Kirsch, beginning. I should have spelled you the whole name. Kirchgaessner. I'll say Gassner. Kirchgaessner. Stephanie, to be specific. In case you're wondering, which Kirchgaessner wrote this for The Guardian? There are several. I don't know. Well, here's the story. The FBI is facing new scrutiny for its 2018 background check of Brett Kavanaugh. You remember why, right? The Supreme Court justice, after a lawmaker suggested that the investigation may have been fake. And I mean, why not suggest that? For several reasons, not the least of which is so much of what happened during the Trump administration really was just fake, entirely faked. I'm glad to see that there are senators willing to say this at this point. Sheldon Whitehouse, a Democratic senator and former prosecutor who serves on the Judiciary Committee, is calling on the newly confirmed Attorney General Merrick Garland to help facilitate, quote, proper oversight by the Senate into questions about how thoroughly the FBI investigated Kavanaugh during his confirmation hearing. There's at least two fronts on which I think the investigation, the background investigation, was lacking. The most famous of which I believe is probably mentioned first here. The Supreme Court the Supreme Court justice was accused of sexual assault by Christine Blasey Ford, we all remember this, and faced several other allegations of misconduct following Ford's harrowing testimony of an alleged assault when she and Kavanaugh were in high school. Kavanaugh denied the claims and, yelled and screamed and cried and spit, as you may recall. The FBI was called to investigate the allegations during the Senate confirmation process, but was later accused by some Democratic senators of conducting an incomplete background check. For example, two key witnesses, Ford and Kavanaugh, were never interviewed as part of the inquiry. And that does seem awfully stupid now that it's just stated so frankly here. Two key witnesses, the accused and the accuser, never interviewed as part of the inquiry. Among the concerns listed in White House's letter to Garland are allegations that some witnesses who wanted to share their accounts with the FBI could not find anyone at the Bureau who would accept their testimony, and that it had not assigned any individual to accept or gather evidence. That does seem like a rather large hole in the investigation, doesn't it? Who was in charge of it? No one. Who conducted it? Nobody. Who'd you interview? No one. What about all these people who had something to say about this stuff? We didn't ask them. Well, that might be fake enough all by itself, I think, to support the conclusion. What'd you do with all that non-information from nobody? Well, we compiled a report. Sure, okay. Well, let's see, some quote here from, from White House. Yes, this was unique behavior in my experience. That does seem unique, as the Bureau is usually amenable to information and evidence. But in this matter, the shutters were closed, the drawbridge drawn up, and there was no point of entry by which members of the public or Congress could provide information to the FBI, White House said. He added that once the FBI decided to create a tip line, senators were not given any information on how or whether new allegations were processed and evaluated. While senators' brief review of the allegations gathered by the tip line showed a stack of information had come in, and stack's a quote, there was no further explanation on the steps that had been taken to review the information, White House said. This tip line appears to have operated more like a garbage chute, with everything that came down the chute consigned without review to the figurative dumpster, he said. Again, par for the course with the Trump operation. Well, set up a tip line. What are we going to do with all the tips? It's going to be very difficult and time-consuming for us to sort them out. Don't sort them out. You can almost see Trump giving the orders for this himself. Don't sort them out. I'm not saying do anything with the tips or treat it like a real thing. I'm saying you set up a tip line so that it looks like you care about tips, and then just, let people record and blather for whatever onto the tip line, and then just throw the stuff out. It doesn't matter whether there is a functioning tip line. It matters that there's an appearance that there's a tip line. That is Trump through and through. Anyway, let's see. White House also criticized FBI Director Chris Wray, who Joe Biden has elected to have remain in place. But he was criticized for not answering questions about the investigation. The FBI did not respond to a request for comment. The DOJ did not respond to a request for comment. While it is unclear whether the FBI would reopen an investigation into Kavanaugh, who is now one of 9 justices on the Supreme Court, the letter could push Garland to force the DOJ to respond to questions about the investigation into Kavanaugh. White House said he is seeking answers about how, why, and at whose behest the FBI conducted a fake investigation if standard procedures were violated, including standards for following allegations gathered through FBI tip lines. So those are all good questions. There are more questions out there lingering about Kavanaugh, and I see that Joan has sent me something else here, too. This is White House's letter, the full letter to Garland on oversight matters, and also OLC politicization. So there are more issues in his letter than just dealing with the Kavanaugh investigation. But in case it's not mentioned in here, still lots of lingering questions, and I very frequently see people asking questions about, well, who paid off Kavanaugh's debt? It was a rather large amount of debt hanging out there that he somehow got away with attributing to buying season tickets for the Washington Nationals for himself and for a bunch of friends, saying he laid out the cash to do this. You know, a federal judge's salary is not huge. I mean, it's pretty good as, you know, your general worker's salary goes, but it's not gigantic, not big enough for him to put up the money for season tickets to the Nationals for other friends, particularly those friends who are working in private practice elsewhere, who are partners at big firms, etc., who were making much more money. But whatever. Maybe he did do that, but he also was, I think, a member of a relatively, I mean, they're all relatively expensive, a country club. Had dues to a country club that got paid off to, and it all got paid off just before his nomination for the Supreme Court was processed, so that it would look on the background check like he didn't have these tremendous outstanding debts. It was all very weird and very fishy, but chiefly I think everybody's more worried about the faking of a background check that was promised just to mollify critics of of Kavanaugh's under these allegations from Christine Blasey Ford. I mean, that's the more serious of the two, I think, just in that it involves the FBI covering up like this, if, or at least questions about whether or not the FBI did that. So anyway, let's see. During Senate confirmation hearings for Garland and nominee for Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco, and in an oversight hearing with FBI Director Chris Wray, White House asked the department to clean up the unfinished business, as he put it, of stonewalled Judiciary Committee oversight during and even before the Trump administration. Garland, Monaco, and Wray all assured White House they would cooperate. This letter responds to the department requests that the senator describe which matters to prioritize. The stonewalled oversight included the department's review of civil litigation based on tobacco industry precedent concerning climate change denial and obstruction by the fossil fuel industry. Interesting as a first priority there. The cursory and politically constrained FBI investigation of allegations of sexual assault regarding Brett Kavanaugh. The Antitrust Division's interaction with automakers regarding their California fuel efficiency standards negotiations, and the department's failure to investigate apparently false statements made by politically active nonprofit groups to the Internal Revenue Service. Wow. So covering a lot of bases there. White House also raised in his letter the troubled record of the Office of Legal Counsel, which has issued a number of decisions in recent years that failed to meet the standards of the department or crumbled under scrutiny in the courts. Full text of the letter follows, but it's dense and relatively long. But I think now at least we've gotten, it was important to have White House's summary, his office's summary of his own letter, so that we could show you just how broad it really was. I mean, there's a common theme here, though. What's going on over at DOJ and FBI with regard to this weird, I mean, I guess politicization across the board, not just where he uses the word with reference to the OLC, but the decision, if there was one, to do anything less than a real background check on Kavanaugh, investigation into, what happened with the IRS folks being accused of making politically motivated investigations of conservative nonprofit groups, the allegation being that they gave a pass to similarly situated liberal nonprofit groups, which they did not, and that there was this big accusation of bias, and it was what can we say, a cause celeb for Republicans for many years. There's lots of fundraising and campaigning off of this distorted picture of how the IRS was doing its job, when in fact the IRS really did need to be cracking down on claims of nonprofit status for a lot of politically connected organizations, most of which really were actually connected to conservatives. It was one of the more obvious cases of their working the refs that's really in existence out there, that they complained and whined that they were being singled out, and thereby created this enormous pressure to drop investigations against their nonprofit groups, which were really doing illegal work and illegally offering their donors tax exemptions for supporting their work when they really had no business doing that at all. So a couple of really good and important glimpses back here from Sheldon Whitehouse, and we'll see whether Merrick Garland and others are able to deliver on that. Okay, now might be a good opportunity to start rolling some of the inquiries, though, about filibuster reform and the like, so that we can prepare between this and the mystery topic and filibuster reform and the White House letter for our visit from Joan. Let's roll. You'll remember the famous opening. I think we'll say that Rich made his opening famous by repeating it, in each one of the segments. I could probably string a couple of these together and edit it out, but I don't know, something comfort about hearing the intro each time.
Hello, this is Rich, also known as Liberal Thinking. I represent a strong progressive view within the Democratic Party, and you can find my article, Busting the Filibuster, on Daily Kos. This series of audio clips addresses this important issue. The Democratic Party faces oblivion. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, by late January, over 100 bills were pending in 28 states to restrict voting rights. Congress has the power to set rules for federal elections, but it can only do that if it can make law. Because a filibuster would require 60 senators to support voter protections, we can only stop this enormous Republican power grab under current rules with support of 10 Republican senators. Republicans in Congress have shown no interest in what's best for the country, so even one Republican senator is out of the question. Current state legislatures will set the boundaries of congressional districts based on the 2020 census. They will then be able to use voter suppression to gain a majority in Congress. And they even have laws pending that would allow Republican legislatures to overturn the popular vote for president and send Republican electors to the Electoral College, rigging the 2024 presidential election. Yet even some Democrats in the Senate, not to mention President Joe Biden, believe we should retain the filibuster. They are worriers. They worry that when Democrats regain the minority, Republicans will use democracy to push through legislation we won't like. This is a tiny problem compared to being locked out of office for all time. Contact your senators and urge them to support enough filibuster reform to at least get critical legislation, like the voting rights bill now pending, adopted by the Senate. This may require eliminating the filibuster or just modifying it sufficiently. Democracy really is on the line. Republicans tried to suppress it at the ballot box. They tried to deny it in the courts. They tried to steal it with a violent insurrection. They are highly motivated because they know that real democracy, with one vote per person, will end their goal of rich elite minority rule. Let's find a way to stop them. In the next few audio segments, I discuss some of the proposals for eliminating or modifying the filibuster. You can find Busting the Filibuster along with other posts by liberal thinking in the All Daily Coast Progressives group. Join our group and make your own contributions. We'd love to hear from you.
Okay, and you should probably join the group, make your own contributions, discuss this thing. I thought that was a good setup in terms of bringing our attention back to the reason why there's a renewed focus, of course, on reforming the filibuster. But it's just one of several. But I think the one that led us into the current discussion is, of course, the question of, well, how do we deal with the fact that H.R. 1, which contains so many reforms that I think very many of us believe are vital to the ability of the Democratic Party to pursue and achieve its agenda under President Biden or under anybody ever at this point, because of the nature of the voter suppression activities under consideration in the various state legislatures, and of course the evidence of just how far Republicans are willing to go to cling to power, up to and including the January 6th insurrection and the effort to overthrow the results of a presidential election. So, if they're able to codify their ability to do these things, quote unquote, legally at any point in the future, I think that would probably spell doom for our ability to resist that or to change direction in any capacity. And of course, if you're voted out of the majority, even if it's done improperly and unfairly, if you can codify the results afterwards and lock Democrats out of power, well, I think we all know what the results of that could be. Not only that, but of course, climate change legislation currently under consideration that Republicans have just been traditionally, so opposed to that they won't even acknowledge the science underlying the proposals, etc. You can see that we're in some considerable danger, and it's an existential problem, and that's what's, I think, swinging a lot of the votes of senators who had previously been opposed to revisiting the use of the nuclear option to make these changes. Now we'll get into, I've got a couple other segments, two more, somewhat longer, but still relatively short segments in which Rich follows up on some of these things and gives us some discussion points about just what reforms we might consider. Some of them we've heard about before. Some of them are new. Some of them, I think, are of his own invention, in fact. But there's been a lot of interesting thought among people now facing, I guess, not facing necessarily the question of filibuster reform for the first time, but for how to structure it, what ought to be done, which changes ought to be made. And some of them I'm just, some of the more traditional ones, I'm still not 100% sure how to get to it, how to structure the vote such that it will work correctly. And then some new proposals that center around the idea that emergency legislation of some kind ought to be exempted. I'm not certain how you could really plausibly define emergency or even define a process for determining when that emergency exists. But on the other hand, the option is nuclear. It doesn't really have to be a finely tuned instrument. It's not a scalpel. It's a nuclear option. Maybe it's not necessary to be that particular about it. Let me roll segment 2 here and we'll see what we're talking about.
Hello, this is Rich, also known as Liberal Thinking. I represent a strong progressive view within the Democratic Party.
Yes,
and you can find my article, Busting the Filibuster, on Daily Coast. Writing in the Washington Post this month, Norm Ornstein proposed reform options he thought all Democrats might be willing to support.
Yes,
he warned that Democrats can only push senators like Joe Manchin of West Virginia so far without pushing them out of the party. Ornstein suggested the goal is to, quote, preserve some rights for the Senate minority with the aim of fostering compromise, unquote. To that end, he suggested 3 options. Option 1, require at least 40 senators to be present and opposing the bill to prevent the question from coming to a vote. Option 2, require 3/5 of the senators to be present and voting. Possibly add to that a requirement that at least one person in the minority be part of the debate. Option 3, change the requirement from 3/5, which is 60 senators, to a lesser number, but still more than 51. Ornstein believes senators like Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema cannot be pressured into eliminating the filibuster, but they might be enticed to reform the rules to get debate and compromise without simply blocking all Democratic initiatives. Ornstein's ideas are part of a broader effort to change the rules. The website Vox suggests a number of additional ways to change the filibuster that centrist Democrats might support. Idea 1. Require opponents to speak on the floor, the way the public thinks a filibuster ought to look. Idea 2. Exempt other matters from the cloture rule besides court appointments and budget bills. These could be either exceptions for classes of legislation or for specific bills. Idea 3. Allow legislation to pass with a simple majority if it was blocked by a filibuster in the previous session of Congress. This allows the public to express their opinion during the intervening election.
I pause it at this point only to, so I don't want this one to get away from me. But I'm not certain. I guess I'll have to go and find the Vox article. But we might need to put a finer point on that one. It's an interesting idea. Allow a bill to bypass the filibuster. I suppose it would be a time-limited debate is the easiest way to do that. If it had been blocked by filibuster in the previous, he says, session of Congress. And I think here we run into some of the terms of art here. And I think that it sounds from the description like they might mean the previous Congress as a whole rather than the previous session. You may recall that a Congress is said to last 2 years based on the term in office of members of the House of Representatives. And so every 2 years when they elect a new House, they resolve that into a new Congress. We're in that, 117th Congress, last Congress. Prior to January 3rd, we were in the 116th Congress. The 118th Congress will be seated in January 3rd, 2023, following the November 2022 elections. Right, so you see how that works. But each Congress lasts 2 years, and more or less each year of the Congress, calendar year roughly, is considered a session of Congress. Each Congress is divided into 2 sessions. We are currently in the first session of the 117th Congress, and the bulk of calendar year 2022 will be the second session of the 117th Congress. I'm not even really clear what purpose that serves these days, given that the recess in between the 2 sessions isn't usually all that long anymore, and there's no effect on legislation from the change in sessions from one session to the next. So I'm not really sure. Anyway, if they really did mean session, that might be something interesting too. It would cut the turnaround period. If your legislation was blocked in the first session of the 117th Congress, could it be brought back for consideration in the second session of the same Congress without being subject to the filibuster? But the description that he gives from the Vox article is that the public will have had an opportunity to evaluate the proposal in an intervening election. Makes me think that they mean bring it back in the next Congress after the midterm elections have gone forward, because there's no election, of course, between sessions of the Congress. So that might just be they've used the wrong terminology there. And I don't know whether that's an acceptable proposal, waiting 2 years essentially to bring something back for. We live with that now, thanks to the filibuster, but it's not a great reform to say we'll live with it next time, except for the fact that, you could possibly get the thing through in a second Congress. Anyway, session would be a lot better, but I don't know if that's what we're really talking about. Let me roll the rest of this before we run into our next break.
Idea 4. Allow a vote on a legislative bill to proceed without the requirement of unanimous consent, so that it would take more than one senator's objection to stop the vote.
Here I pause it again because that's just, I don't know. I'll pull up the Vox article. That's just wrong. While it is the case that the Senate usually operates on unanimous consent, that, of course, isn't the only way they can operate. If one senator is the only senator objecting to a bill moving forward, they can always go to a motion to proceed and then vote by majority vote, or if they filibuster the motion to proceed, get their 60 votes to move forward. So, I don't know. That's just a misstatement of the current situation, I think.
I don't think any of these proposals quite get to the objections I'm hearing from Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema. Changing the vote threshold, or how it is calculated, simply makes it possible for the majority party to have a better chance of passing the legislation they want. This moves away from Manchin's stated desire to have the parties come together to pass legislation they can agree on. And a talking filibuster, as in Vox's Idea 1, requires the public to care about and pay attention to the debate in Congress. That's not going to happen. The public is used to getting small, clearly defined options and then swiping left or swiping right. The filibuster fix needs to fit their attention span. Do you remember when I started this sentence? I didn't think so. That's the attention deficit disorder we must deal with. Whatever fix we make to the filibuster, the American people cannot be required to understand what the Senate is doing. They need to get a result, which they will either then like or dislike. Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema appear to want a Senate where all members have a part in the final legislation. In the following audio segments, I propose possible changes that would directly address this issue. If you're in a hurry, you can read those options directly on Daily Kos. You can find Busting the Filibuster along with other posts by Liberal Thinking in the All Daily Kos Progressives group. Join our group and make your own contributions. We'd love to hear from you.
Okay, and so it certainly becomes a great pitch for the All Progressives Daily Kos group, and you'll get to know Rich from his introductions and then the outros of all of that. But yeah, there are 6 segments in total, and I have a third one queued up, but we might save number 3 for tomorrow and maybe roll 3 and 4 when we get into specific proposals that he's considering for reform of the filibuster. I'll have to go and find that Vox article. I guess I can take those clips and type in the text and find it again. Seems like they missed the mark on 1 or 2 of their descriptions of what the current situation is. Anyway, top of the hour break coming up next. 10 o'clock hour, half of our show. The second session comes after this. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Man, okay. That is a short break. I'll have to rethink that whole thing. Okay, and I haven't been able to find the Vox piece in that 1 minute, but I'm sure if I dig it up after the show, we'll be able to dissect it in the coming days. I think, at this point, I'll hang on to the third segment for later on. Although, what's been really intriguing, I guess by way of preview on this, has been the relatively new proposal. I think the proposals that hung around from last time around, the idea for the talking filibuster, standing filibuster, or somehow flipping the burden of the filibuster onto the minority so that they are the ones that have to produce bodies in order to keep extended debate, the real name of the filibuster, the official terminology used in the House rules or Senate rules about it. Flipping the burden so that the minority has to produce either keep 40 or 41 of their senators on the floor at all times, or keep speaking at all times, or some combination of both, or whatever. All of these were very definitely proposed early on in the Democratic-controlled post-2010, let's say, movement for filibuster reform. And they were considered, and they were certainly considered as part of the packages of the pre-2013 efforts. I guess the efforts between 2010 and 2013. So I guess really we're talking about the beginnings of the new Congresses in 2010 and 2012, when people who had taken up the mantle of reform in the Senate, including Jeff Merkley, who now takes on the same role again, as Greg mentioned yesterday. He put forward under what we would call the original constitutional option plan proposed by Gold and Gupta, who I mentioned before. Those of you who've been following the subject for a long time may recall that this goes way back, but Gold and Gupta basically proposed a procedure that was much closer much more closely tied to the 1975 reforms, or the procedure used to implement the 1975 reforms. And the procedure, or I guess I should say, the 75 procedure was a process derived from earlier efforts beginning in the mid-1950s and stretching all the way into 1975 to construct a parliamentary workaround that involved something a little bit more subtle, to say, it's a lot more subtle really, than the outright exercise of pure majority power in the form of, I think, we'll call the nuclear option. They were the same thing, of course, in the beginning, but I think now you need to differentiate between them. In the nuclear option, the easier of the two to explain, and the one with which more people are familiar, we could simply describe things as, just pure majority power and wielding the gavel and the power of the gavel and saying, we want cloture on executive nominations and judicial nominations in 2013, except the Supreme Court, to be able to invoke cloture on those nominations with a simple majority vote. And they did it, in November of 2013, right in the middle of what were we in? The first session of whichever Congress we were in, who knows, in 2012. We'll have to count it backwards and figure it out. But right in the middle of the session, though, they just said, all right, well, we think that the interpretation of the rules should change. And we have the ability to do that with, if we can put together a majority in favor of either sustaining a ruling from the chair that that's okay, or overturning a rule from the chair that says it's not okay, or, tabling a motion from the other side to appeal the ruling of the chair, whichever way you set it up. If you had a majority stitched together to simply say, we recognize that the rules don't say this, but we want to establish the precedent that it's okay in this situation to do this, regardless of what the rules say, you were able to do it. In other words, a pure exercise of majority power, just outright. It differed from what Gold and Gupta described, and on which they hung the name constitutional option, and in important ways. Let me see if there's any way to make this long-ish story short. But basically, the idea was that at the beginning of a brand new Congress, there was this unique opportunity in the Senate. There's a parallel opportunity in the House, and maybe we can draw that parallel to make everybody understand it in case this is new to you. But if it's old to you, I'll try and make it as short as I can. The House, of course, elects all of its members all at once every 2 years. And so it's a totally renewed House, even though 90% of incumbents who run for re-election win again. We consider this to be a brand new House. And so they come in and they adopt their rules anew every time they renew themselves every 2 years. And even this is something of a technicality because for the most part, adopting the new rules means you adopt, you move to say, we'll just adopt all the same rules that we had last time so we don't reinvent the wheel, but with the following changes. So it's really just about adopting changes. But technically, they're saying we're adopting everything all over again because we're a new House. And in the Senate, the custom has always been to consider the Senate to be what they call a continuing body. I have lots of quarrels with whether or not this is really true. But at any rate, they consider themselves to be a continuing body because they only elect 1/3 of their membership every 2 years. And 2/3, and that's an important number, it comes up a lot, 2/3 of the Senate remains in office even during these election years when 1/3 is reelected. 2/3, of course, is it's an important number in parliamentary terms. It's enough in the Senate to vote to expel somebody from the Senate. It's enough to vote to waive the rules of the Senate. It's enough to vote to waive the rules of the House as well. But there's a real parliamentary reason for it. And the basic principle of parliamentary law, the rules of order, and I guess it comes from Roberts, but I'm not certain whether or not it does. But basic parliamentary law is that an awful lot of things that can't ordinarily be done by the rules can be done outside of the rules with the consent of 2/3 of the body. So it's no mystery why they would consider, if only 1/3 of the body is renewed every 2 years, why they would consider themselves to just be continuing. Now, why they then consent to allowing Congresses to be numbered by the composition of the House, I don't really know, but I guess it becomes too complicated to do it any other way. But, and the House does, of course, represent 50% of the legislative body as a whole. So, I don't know. I guess it's not much of a concession. But anyway, the theory was that because 2/3 of the senators remained in office and 1/3 was renewed, the Senate rules didn't need to be readopted at the beginning of each new Congress. 2/3 of the senators said, we're still there, and said, we're still cool with the old rules. Those are the ones we agreed to operate by. And the new 1/3 it's sort of like the reverse. You, by accepting your job, your seats as senators, agree to abide by the rules that we've kept in place these last couple of years. And it's a little bit weird. I mean, essentially, to say it's a continuing body, I mean, does it really make any sense to say that, you served with, Daniel Webster from back in the day, and various other of the, Calhoun and other lunatic senators, and some non-lunatic senators who have long since died, haven't been in the Senate in years. Is it really a continuing body to that extent? Are we really bound? Does it make any sense to bind the Senate to rules and precedents set so many hundreds of years in the past? I mean, it's interesting that the Senate considers itself this continuing body, but at the same time, every once in a while reminds everybody that that you do have the right, the prerogative, under the Constitution, to set your own rules of procedure. Well, if there's to be any meaning to that, Gold and Gupta reconciled it this way. Sure, there's this continuing body theory, but there's also this constitutional, mandate that each house of the legislature will, adopt its own rules of procedure, and can do that at any time. The old way of reconciling it was to say, sure, the new Senate can adopt rules for itself, or, at any point during its proceedings. But one of the rules that it's adopted is a rule on how to change the rules, which is that a proposed rules change was subject to filibuster, and that the rules described how to get around that filibuster. And the answer is with 2/3 of those present and voting to close debate on the proposed rules change. Then you could go ahead and adopt new rules. So the theory was that the rules continued from one session to the next and one Congress to the next in the Senate without having to have an explicit vote to renew them. But that at the very beginning of a new Congress, that there was a moment at which the Senate acceded to, or was thought to accede to, the rules of the previous Congress continuing in force. That the way to reconcile the continuing body theory with the prerogative clearly spelled out in the Constitution that the Senate, like the House, could adopt its own rules of procedure was that each new Congress began with the opportunity for any senator to say, now, hold on a second, I don't agree that the rules ought to continue. That the normal practice was that unless anybody said anything and made any objections and called for any votes, then the assumption was that the old rules would continue. But the reconciliation of the two competing theories was that at the beginning of a new Congress, a senator, new or otherwise, could say, all right, hold on a second. It is said that the rules continue in this place unless anybody says anything. Well, I'm going to say something. And I'm going to use the first moments of a new Senate to say, I propose a rules change. So the Gupta theory, which was developed out of the theory that promoted rules change and filibuster reform as early as the mid-50s, all the way through the 70s, the theory was that if anybody stood up and said, hold on a second, I object to our going forward. The working theory here is that if the Senate begins to do routine business as if operating under the continuing old rules, then you would be deemed to have accepted those old rules as your own. But I will object to that happening right at the beginning and say we should instead adopt new rules. And because I have made this objection and made this proposal before conducting any normal business, which would then signal that I had accepted the old rules, we're not operating under the old rules at this moment because I've blocked them from continuing by raising my objection. And if the old rules aren't in force at the moment because we haven't agreed to let them continue in force, then what are we operating under? We're operating under sort of general parliamentary law, which contains no supermajority requirement for closing debate. It would, like anything else, have an opportunity to vote by majority rules, presumably, to start debate, to close debate, and then to resolve any questions. So this was an interesting theory, and they couldn't get anybody necessarily to agree to it until the mid-50s when they finally got, of all people, they got Richard Nixon serving as vice president to Dwight Eisenhower and serving, therefore, as president of the Senate to rule in their favor and to say, yeah, this is a workable reconciliation of the two theories. At the beginning, the very beginning, the first day of a new Senate, you can raise this objection. If the majority of the Senate will go along with you, you've got an opportunity to change the rules without having to worry about cloture. If the majority of the Senate won't go along with you, well, then you're screwed. They want to continue under the old rules. And this time we will have an explicit vote. And if you're defeated by a majority, then you lose. Sorry. And that happened for the first several rounds of attempts at filibuster reform. And it wasn't until 1975 that they really got a solid majority for the first time to say, all right, we will allow this we'll recognize this weird magical moment at the beginning of a brand new Senate for you to propose a change not because we magically now believe in it and haven't believed in it since the 50s, but because they put together a majority and were able to say a majority now gives the thumbs up to this procedure. And now the rules are thrown wide open. And it was at that point that the anti-reform senators finally broke and panicked and said, all right, well, we face the possibility of a bare majority changing the rules here, and that's anathema to us. So their compromise was this. They were about to get steamrollered. So instead they said, how about this? Instead of our ratifying this steamroller operation, this nuclear option, constitutional option, we'll offer you this. We believe in the old rules. We've just been overruled, but we believe in the old rules. And the old rules say you got to have 67 votes. You got to have 2/3 of those present and voting anyway to invoke cloture on a proposal to change the rules. We'll provide you with those votes. We'll switch our votes and vote in favor of cloture on this proposed rules change in exchange for, one, changing the rules on cloture from 2/3 to 3/5, but it's got to be 3/5 of those duly chosen and sworn, that harder to reach 60, the affirmative 60, rather than 3/5 of the Senate present and voting. So that, again, 59 senators won't work to invoke cloture. It has to be 60. It can't just be 3/5 of those who show up that day. So that was a real barrier, and it became a real problem, and we're running into that problem now. But that was the compromise that the anti-reform folks exacted from it. Not to mention this other totally weird one that gets ignored all the time, which was what we'll do is we'll give you the votes to get to 2/3 on cloture, so that on the record it looks like what really invoked cloture was a 2/3 vote of the Senate, not the 51 or 50, however many it was, not the bare majority that voted to invoke cloture under this nuclear/constitutional option, but something completely different. And then, having invoked cloture under the old rules, we'll change the rules in this way, which make things a little bit harder than what you're proposing. But on top of that, we would like to then call a vote on reconsidering the question of whether or not a simple majority can really do this, at which point we want everybody to change their votes and flip on this and say, no, it's not true that a bare majority can vote to change the rules. We want to erase the precedent of the vote we just took a minute ago, but in exchange, we'll give you the reform you want. And they actually worked that out and got it and did it, and then went ahead and reconsidered the vote and attempted to erase the precedent. But, that just was not something that was actually workable, but because everybody remembered what they had just done. But what was interesting was that, 75, so like 30 years later, and then add another 10 years before the Democrats actually did it in 2013, 30 to 40 years later, by that point, everybody either was pretending or really did forget about it. So maybe the erasure of the precedent really did something, even though the old precedent and the vote of the erasure of the precedent both stayed on the record. Everybody pretended to have forgotten their ability to change the rules with the bare majority for many years, including people who had voted to do it that first time in 1975, who were still in the Senate in 2010, 2013, when they were asked to do it again. So anyway, that was supposed to be the short version of how we got to this version of, or how we deviated from the version. The original Gupta vision of revising reusing the 1975 precedent built on all of the Nixon rulings through the 50s to make this change. The assumption, I think, of Gold and Gupta, and my assumption for the years from 2010 through 2012, was that they were going to opt to do things the way they did in 75, on the first day of a new Congress or shortly thereafter. As it turns out, in 1975, they actually didn't do this in the first days of the new Congress. They did it in March of 1975. After, though, on the first day of the Congress, they needed to get on to some other things. There was some, like hot political subjects going on in the mid-70s. But as a matter of Senate courtesy, even the anti-reformers agreed at that point to say, well, you could hold things up from January through March if we forced you to do things that way, talking about filibuster reform. But instead, we'll grant you a unanimous consent request to hold the question of rules reform open indefinitely, as if we were debating it on the first day of a new Congress, so that we can put this aside for a little while, deal with some hot issues, and then come back to this stuff. I don't know if they planned to do it in March, but whenever they eventually return to it, it would be done by unanimous consent as though it were on the first day of Congress. So it operated the same way, even though it actually ended up happening in March, just in case you were wondering about that. If you go and look it up and you look for it in January of 1975, this debate, you won't find it. It happens in March. And so Gold and Gupta assumed that that any further reforms, even the proposed reform they had for Republicans to revise the filibuster rules such that they could get around filibusters on judicial nominations. That was the whole point of their 2004 and 2005 push, was that this would happen at the beginning of a new Congress. What happened, though, of course, was that in 2006, at the beginning of the new Congress, there was a Democratic majority in the Senate, so their scheme was dead. But now it was in the hands of Democrats, and they could run with it. And anyway, so by 2010, we had seen the Republican obstruction posing a problem not only for judicial nominations under Barack Obama, but causing problems for, or possibly preventing the passage of the Affordable Care Act as well. They managed to get around that one using budgetary tricks like reconciliation, which were not subject to the filibuster. And, of course, finally flexing their muscle for the short window during which they actually had 60 Democratic votes in the Senate. So fortunate circumstances. Otherwise, you might have seen perhaps the filibuster reform happen then. Instead, it happened in 2013 when the Democrats ran into an intractable problem and no longer had the 60. But they, at that point, abandoned, in November of 2013, abandoned the part about doing it at the beginning of the Congress. And there was no unanimous consent request at the beginning of that Congress to allow discussion of this as though operating on the first day in November of that year. They just went ahead and did it. But in 2010 and in 2012, or I guess 2011 following the 2010 elections, and 2013 in January following the 2012 elections, you did see Jeff Merkley and other supporters of reform. Tom Udall comes to mind as one of the leaders in that group, pressing for opening day reforms along the Gold-Gupta model, but then realizing, I guess, with the help of Harry Reid, who eventually did change his mind about using procedures like this, that, well, if it's really just a matter of a ruling from the chair, you could have that ruling happen at any time. And really, if you think about it, there's no reason to think that a majority is any less able to exercise the constitutional prerogative to set its own rules of procedure in November than it would be in January. So let's just go for it. And that was the end of the constitutional version of the whole option. Anyway, so I differentiate between the two that way. And when I say constitutional option, I'm usually talking about doing it at the beginning of a new Congress, setting the rules ahead of time. And I it's probably fairer to do things that way than it is to do it situationally. However, we've now been operating on that model since 2013, and that leads us to the proposal to change the rules with respect to cloture on things like what people are designating emergency legislation, which is kind of a, maybe an unworkable standard in the long term. And it may just end up that, look, the filibuster is just gone across the board because, if you have a precedent that says, well, emergency legislation, which we currently define as things like H.R. 1, voting rights, I would imagine that we would want to use something like that for climate change, which is, in fact, a global emergency, things like that. But surely Republicans will end up defining things that they prefer, like tax cuts, as an emergency as well in the future. And then, the rule will just degenerate along the way of its own weight until finally we're just declaring everything to be an emergency piece of legislation and using it. And if we don't like the precedent that sends, I suppose we could end up voting it through and then voting to reconsider the question of whether or not it was emergency legislation and erasing that precedent and seeing whether that works. Anyway, you can get into all sorts of permutations on it. And anyway, I'm just not sure how it would work in the long term, something like this. But I thought, all right, well, if you're a believer in the ability to do this at any point with a bare majority, then if you can get a majority to agree with your definition of something being an emergency, then I guess that's it. So people came up with this new design of why don't we simply say that the filibuster doesn't apply in cases of executive nominations, judicial nominations, and voting rights legislation. which obviously H.R. 1 covers. What sorts of distortions is that likely to lead to? I don't know. If you're really rules-bound, you'll find that if you wanted to pass legislation about, I don't know, bicycle regulation and couldn't find a way to make that an emergency, you could include a voting rights provision in a section of the bill and just graft it on there and say, voila, there we go. It's a bill about voting rights and bicycles, and therefore not subject to the filibuster. Expect it. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning. I have good news to report. Many more listeners like you are making critical contributions that keep our show on the air. Makes good sense, of course, and patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it simple. Now you can make easy, secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. Maybe you'd like to thank us for helping keep you sane during the Trump era. Maybe you're looking forward to in-depth explanations of what's going on in the Biden administration. Whatever it is that keeps you listening, we need your help to keep bringing it to you. And hey, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running with those options too. Thanks again, everyone, for all of your support. We literally could not do this without you. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Joan McCarter joins us for our fourth session, we'll say, of the 1 millionth Congress of the Kagro in the Morning Show. I don't know what number we're in here. But, okay, well, I got into the weeds a little bit on sessions versus Congresses at some point earlier on, and then spent the last segment. I think we haven't entirely exhausted, of course, the filibuster subject for the day. There's plenty of room to expand on that. I'm exhausted from discussing it, but that's nothing new. But there's still
You've done the
plenty of
weedy
material.
part. I'll do the Durbin's speech was actually kind of a big deal,
Okay.
I believe.
All right, let's find out.
For one
why.
thing, go to Durbin's homepage right now on his official website.
All right, let's see. We'll find. Here we go. Home. U.S. Senator Dick Durbin. Durbin.senate.gov, everybody. All right. The time
picture.
is now. Yes, there it is.
The very top of his page.
Yeah. Durbin, the time is now for filibuster reform. Okay. I'll take it.
I think what we're seeing is, since he is majority whip, since he's second in command, Democratic leadership saying, this is happening.
Yeah, I guess.
And giving Manchin and Sinema time to say, okay, well, this is happening. What are we going to do? That's how I'm interpreting this.
I would have to say you're right about that. They've put him on notice, and they're not calling him out and screaming at him. They're saying, all right, well, now's the time to think about it. You've said you're open to some things. Let's talk about what you're open to. Let's see what we can do.
But that it is going to happen. And he couched it in the smartest way, describing at the very beginning Strom Thurmond's 24-hour and, 38-minute
Is that right?
filibuster against the Civil Rights Act.
Mm-hmm.
Or was it the Voting Rights Act?
Now that you say it, I have my doubts about which one it was. But, we'll see what does he mention in his speech. Well, I guess we could look that up. But I'm sure he was opposed to both. Which one he stood for 24 hours for, I can't recall off the top of my head. Because
it was 1957, so it was the Civil Rights Act.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
So he's couching it in terms, he says, this is a Jim Crow holdover.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
This is what Strom Thurmond was defending, and it's what's happening now. So I think couching it in those terms was important. I think it's telling Joe Manchin and Kirsten, do you want to be upholding Jim Crow laws? Do you want to be a white supremacist? Do you want to be like Strom Thurmond? And, publicly, they're not going to be able to say, well, yeah, sure. I align myself with that.
Not likely to be something they're going to want to deal with, no. Okay. Yeah.
So all of that I find encouraging.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, and they've done a pretty good job at framing it that way. I mean, well, let's be honest, the Republicans did a pretty good job framing it that way. And like the whole, I guess the whole filibuster reform thing in total, it's been Republicans set out the terms of the debate, and then the rug gets pulled out from under them, and Democrats take the majority and say, "Hey, thanks for the idea." So here, Republicans framed the filibuster as a Jim Crow relic and used it for that purpose, and then they lost the majority, and now we say, "You remember when they did this, and you remember why they did this?" There's no erasing that. Are you for it or against it? Against it? Good. Let's get rid of it. Oh, and you're kind of stuck.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
so.
I think
So
well
does
done.
that handle filibuster for the day?
Well, at the moment, yeah, because we're still just at that opening salvo. But yeah, I mean, I think that's basically it. That brings us up from, okay, well, here's how we got to where we are, to, all right, exactly where are we now? And sure, Manchin and Sinema have said no to it. How do you answer that? And the answer is, well, not only will it be getting in the way of major legislation that you actually favor, and it will be excellent for your states as well as everybody else's, but it leaves you on the side of the segregationists, and at a severe, at a really sore point for that. Remember, of course, the segregationists would be your right-wing white supremacists, and I think we've just had a big problem, and it continues with right-wing white supremacists, and I mean, were you again? Are you for civil rights?
And that one that's still here with us, Ron Johnson,
right, and
doubling down on his racism.
Sure, and the other weirdo insurrectionists that are brought along with him. It's a tough spot to drag. You don't want to be dragging your feet at this point. So, all right,
And I think let's just keep on it a little bit.
Sure.
Because I've got all of these thoughts in my head that I need to write out.
Yeah, all right. I hope you do it.
McConnell began his floor speech today talking about the filibuster, of course.
Okay.
Reading quotes from Democrats previously insisting that the filibuster remain intact. I'm sure one of those that he was quoting was Durbin.
Yeah, probably.
So, McConnell's taking them seriously.
Yeah, okay. Well, he ought to. And, I mean, that just gives us the opportunity, of course, to read quotes from Republicans from 2004 insisting that this was totally legit, and that abuse of the filibuster by Democrats gave them all the rationale they needed to change the filibuster rules. They chickened out, but, whose problem is that? Not mine.
What it also, it's total tea leaf reading, trying to figure out what this means for what happens next in the Senate, where they go next.
Yeah.
Because there was some talk that they were going to immediately pivot to infrastructure. Well, they don't have any bills right now on infrastructure.
Oh.
And that would be one where you would hope that you could get some Republicans on board because, A, they're bringing back earmarks.
Mm-hmm.
So Republican senators could get their pet projects into it. And if it's infrastructure, it's jobs in their states. So it would be something you would think you could get Republican buy-in into. Manchin has said, I am not going to agree to doing this by reconciliation.
Infrastructure?
I'll block that.
Okay.
So is it that bill that they turn to next, thinking that maybe they can show Manchin that no, Republicans, even on a bill that helps them that they should want to pass, they refuse to do it, so we have to blow up the filibuster in order to make it happen? Or do they take the bill that's already there before them, H.R. 1, the For the People Act, that Klobuchar is going to put out of rules probably next week?
Okay.
And do they make that the filibuster fight?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It should, Yeah, that puts Manchin and Sinema immediately in that position of defending Jim Crow stuff and dooming the Democratic Party perhaps in future elections by killing H.R. 1. Of course, their Republican friends will be telling them if you force H.R. 1 through, especially using the nuclear option, then you can forget about our cooperation on infrastructure later on. So it might be that Sinema and Manchin might say, well, let's do infrastructure first to see if we can't get some Republicans on board to pass it, and then we'll consider H.R. 1 where we're going to have a fight with them. But the rest of the Democratic Senate caucus may say, no, let's do H.R. 1 first to show you, one, to dissuade you from even trying to work with Republicans and coax them along under the idea that you're going to get some of their votes in the end, which you probably won't, on infrastructure. So we'll save you the frustration, but also eliminate the filibuster ahead of time for that because we had to do it for H.R. 1. Or do they say, well, we'll show you exactly how, disastrous this would be to do the other way? I don't know. It's a good question.
I'm very curious to see how it plays out.
Yeah.
Or do they do the baby steps thing?
Yeah.
Do they do what some folks have talked about? Norm Ornstein talked about this. Stacey Abrams came out with it Sunday pushing this idea that you make civil rights, voting rights, anti-filibuster.
A specific category, yeah.
Put it in a category like now judicial nominations and cabinet positions are.
Yeah.
And budget reconciliation is. Make that specifically simple majority. They could do it.
Yeah.
They have to have 51 votes to do it, though, right?
Right.
I mean, you're making that change on the fly. You have to have the majority there to do it.
Right. So, yeah, that would be interesting. I had never really thought of doing it that way, but...
Can Harris...
I don't know. What?
Preside there? Does Harris have a vote there?
In deciding whether or not...
In Senate procedures?
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, if they're tied, then yeah.
So she can also break ties on procedural stuff.
I believe that that's the case. I know. I mean people say, well, that's unfair. She'd be voting on her own, on her if she's in the chair and hands down the ruling. She then votes on her own ruling. But that's the way it works all the time with senators in the chair.
Yeah.
I believe she can actually do that.
She is the president of the Senate, so yeah, that kind of makes her of the Senate.
Yeah, so it sort of works that way. But I believe she can do that, and so this leads us to this sort of new invention of the idea of, well, let's just create categories for which there won't be any, for which you can invoke cloture by a simple majority, which seems weird until you realize, well, that's exactly what they did with the judicial nominations in 2013 and 17. They just said, it doesn't make any particular sense, but that's going to be our ruling, or that's the ruling you're going to need to overturn, however they set this thing up. They could very easily just say, yeah, for anything involving voting rights. So, of course, it then leads to, leakage later on when somebody throws a voting rights provision in a bill that's about something else, or simply declares by majority vote that there's no voting rights material in here, but we're going to say that there is. But okay, less filibusters. Great. I mean, I guess ultimately, they'll use it to pass some things which are probably horrific. But we knew that. We knew that they would. They promised they would. We promised we would when they threatened it the first time. So somebody should do it already. So why not have it be us? And then they'll pass some terrible things, and we'll try and deal with them the best we can. Either repeal them if they're really super horrific when we regain the majority, and that gets pointed to all the time. Well, we're going to have this terrible situation where laws change every time you elect a new Congress, to which other people say, yes, of course they will. That's what the purpose of it is, well, we should have some stability. Yeah, we should. But, I mean, I guess if people elect lunatics from the other side with, some frequency, we're going to have to undo lunacy with some frequency. I'm sure they think the same thing about us, but okay, I'm sorry we don't have a period of greater political stability, but I don't know exactly what magic hat you think we should pull that out of.
Right.
I mean, I'd like to have stability, and if...
The one that rolls us back to 1957.
Yeah, I guess. But, yeah.
I mean, honestly, I do believe that they would roll us back to 1857 if they possibly could.
Sure. I mean, if they could get away with it. And I guess the worry is, well, under this, under an extreme version of the nuclear option, they could. Yeah, they could. And then there would be a reaction to it, and then it would be repealed.
I don't think they're going to be able to reinstate only white property males can have a vote.
Not comfortably.
I don't think they're going to be able to make that one happen.
No. Well,
I think they want to.
I guess.
At least one of them.
I mean, in the state legislatures, I think there are some people who think that they could do that. There's no doubt about it.
Well, definitely in the Idaho state legislature.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Right. Despite notwithstanding the efforts of your former Supreme Court Chief Justice. But, yeah, there are certainly people who think, down in Georgia right now, I mean, what's the basis for saying you can't bring a lawn chair with you if you have to wait a long time in line to vote? That's unconstitutional. What in the world? What's the legal basis for that?
And somebody who just happens to be walking by can't hand you a bottle of water?
Yeah, right. Because, what? Public safety? No. Because... there's really literally nothing, but they're just gonna do it and I guess see if it lasts at least one election cycle before getting overturned by the courts. But if they can get an election in there in between, fine. There's
right.
No court's going to say invalidate it.
Unless something changes on the Supreme Court, does it get overturned by the courts?
Right. Yeah. I mean, there is that. That's the other plan. What if we had 9 Kavanaughs? Would they overturn it, even though it's totally ridiculous? And I know it's totally ridiculous. I'll admit it's totally ridiculous. But I got 9 Kavanaughs on the Supreme Court. And if they won't do anything about it, then I'll have 2 elections my way, or 3 or 4, until I don't know what, until Democrats storm the Capitol and threaten to hang the vice president, I guess.
Until we're not here anymore, unfortunately.
Right.
I mean,
that's what the aim is. I mean, yeah. So I don't know. They're coming up with. It's certainly no crazier to say, well, look, there's just going to be certain categories of votes that are not subject to the filibuster. It's not sustainable, but I don't care. We didn't want the filibuster around for anything. So,
yeah.
Do it by baby steps. There will be situations where people just lie about what qualifies to get something through, but that's just another baby step towards getting rid of the filibuster. And if you go into it with the expectation that, yeah, it means Republicans will be able to pass some bad things, but if they're bad, then we're just going to have to mobilize our voters and undo them. Yep. And I think that's kind of the way people thought it was going to work from the beginning.
I think so.
So I'm not opposed necessarily. I know we're in for a bumpy ride, but maybe we'll win a bunch of elections. Of course, we can't win them unless you pass something like H.R. 1, and, I guess that's...
Which, yes, allows our voters to actually vote.
Right.
So
yeah, that's the obviously the importance of it. The existential importance of it is what saves you from the worry that Republicans will pass something horrific is, well, we'll just have to outvote them and then repeal it. You're going to have to make sure that the path is open to outvote them. You just can't live any other way. So,
and you have to sort of come to the realization that the only way we have Democratic majorities ever again is if we get rid of the filibuster so that our people can vote.
Right. Give yourself a chance. And
then we try to tackle majority rule.
Yeah. Right. Well, in this sense, another reason why this election cycle in Georgia was so important, not just the fact that, well, okay, so we won both Senate seats so that we were able to have 50 so that we can actually make some of these things a possibility. The Georgia election cycle and Stacey Abrams' work there stands for the proposition that places that you thought were beyond your reach and we could never reverse the trends there, or, we say, oh, okay, well, we'll outvote them and then repeal their terrible laws. Well, how can we do that? Think about all the times we've lost these close elections. Look at Georgia. If anybody had told you a couple of years ago that, Georgia's going to have 2 Democratic senators after the next election, you wouldn't have believed it.
And vote for Joe Biden.
Right. But, do the work of it. All the math that everybody has always reminded you when we fall into bad habits like, getting frustrated and saying on Twitter, screw Texas, we had enough of them, let them secede, or whatever, any part of the South. And everybody reminds you, look, that's not what the state is really like on the ground. You'd be stranding millions of loyal Democratic voters and very vulnerable ones at that. You can't do that. And everybody realizes, okay, I know, I wasn't really saying we should just let them secede. I was just frustrated. But, well, the next step of that is if you actually organize them on the ground, what does the majority of Mississippi really look like? Well, It's a lot more democratic than you think. It's just a problem that we can't get them to the polls either more mundane problems like we can't motivate them to move to the polls, but more often much more dangerous and oppressive problems like they won't let them get there.
Yeah.
So,
and they're already siloed into gerrymandered districts where their vote is discounted, essentially.
Right. But, again, right. Spend some time touring and counting down there, or just look at the demographics and you say, man, if we could just get all these people the right to vote, guarantee it, and get them to the polls, Mississippi looks a lot different. I don't know why everybody forgets that. When people think about that and say, well, Mississippi, my God, they haven't had a minority senator, a black senator ever, and they've been Republicans since the realignment and da-da-da. Wait a second. Hold on a second. Now that you think about it. They have had. When did they have those blacks? Oh, yeah. Well, they always say, the throwaway phrase is always, since Reconstruction. There hasn't been a black senator there since Reconstruction, as though that were not a valid time period. You mean,
right.
You mean they haven't had a black senator since black people were actually guaranteed the right to vote in ways that actually got in the way of allowing the votes from white people who made it their business to try to prevent black people from voting? That's when they had black senators? Yeah. Let's do that. You want that's an interesting thing. Okay, I got an idea. You Republican senators say you want to roll back the clock to 1857? Let's do it. I'll bump it forward a little bit. 1867. Now let's try that and have an election then. Not everything, of course. It was not a good situation. Yeah, they won the elections under force of arms from the North, but it wasn't like, it was awesome to be black in Mississippi in 1867.
In 1867, no.
Yeah.
No,
So
it was
we'll
not.
keep some of the modern conveniences, like, not allowing people to murder you. That would be helpful. But when you really let the population vote, it's a totally different story. They may be more democratic than your state.
Oh,
Think about
definitely.
that. No, so
Than my state?
your state.
Yeah.
Well, okay, I forgot who I was talking to. That's true. But even there, that we remind people, there's a lot of blue lives in the Boise area. Don't lose track of
There
them.
are, and around the state too. And it's important to remember that they're around the state because those are the people that are really isolated.
Yeah. Throw them a lifeline. But, yes. Well, so, don't forget about them. And there's the importance of H.R. 1 for you. And now it's just a question of, all right, does it make more strategic sense to do it first?
The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act.
Okay. More important work there. I'm losing track of all the Well, that's good news.
Those
Lose
are
track
the
of all
two
the
key
great
ones
bills.
on civil and voting rights.
Okay.
Traditional. We've also got the Equality Act that the House passed.
Okay.
That
Yes.
would, for instance, help here in Idaho, where the legislature refuses to, the campaign has been add LGBTQ people into our civil protections at the state level.
Okay.
So they can't be fired just because of their orientation.
Yes.
They can't be denied housing. They can't be denied medical care. So the Equality Act, which does all of that, also passed the House, and that's the next thing that is going to be coming up in the Senate, and we'll see. And that one's a challenge specifically for Cinema,
Yeah.
who considers herself in the LGBTQ community.
Yes,
Last I
okay.
saw,
Yeah. Although I don't know, man.
it's hard to meet with her. But she's said publicly, "I'm bisexual."
Yeah.
So
I understand she's backtracked on that more than one opportunity.
Has she?
Somehow, or I don't think she's said I'm not,
I'm
but
shocked.
she's
Cinema's
just such an
acting
odd,
on something fundamental.
odd person. And I mean, I don't know. I mean, I didn't see it firsthand, so it may have been her simply saying, well, I don't consider that to be my defining characteristics such that I will only legislate on that basis, which is okay. That's a fair statement, but we were hoping you would remain aware.
Use that community to help
Yeah.
get her elected.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so there's a room to walk that tightrope a little better. I'm thinking of like Danica Rome in the state legislature here in Virginia, who made it clear that I'm running certainly as an openly transgender person, but I'm not running necessarily on a transgender agenda. I have to be careful saying that. It's a tongue twister. But making her primary issue transportation and road construction. Like, okay,
Yeah?
that's great. Yeah. Like, and I
Good for her.
drive to work. I'm transgender every time I do it, but I drive to work just like you. Like, that's a really interesting, and it's worked, and it's gotten her reelected, so pretty cool. And I mean, so there's room for it, but what you can't do is say, oh no, I'm not. I'm backing off of that now because of reasons. And I don't know what electoral advantage she thinks that it might afford her. I think it would be a problem, a huge problem. But I don't know.
I would think so.
I'm just saying she's a little unpredictable, and it's difficult to read her. Always. Even on something like this, which should be...
Even on something like
look,
this.
she has said this. She should be standing by it. Yeah, well, she's not, because she's a little odd. Huh.
That's one way of putting it.
Yes.
And not because she calls herself bisexual. She's a little odd because she seems to not have a whole lot of principle.
Right.
But anyway...
Yes.
I got totally derailed by the filibuster because I always do, because we've been talking about it forever. The other thing that we've been talking about that the mighty OCD asked us about last week.
Yes, right.
Was Congressional Review Act.
Right. That was the surprise thing that I made a big deal of. Now we have no time for it.
The thing we were going to talk about, which we don't have a whole lot of time, but Politico was thinking along the lines of us and asked about it.
Yes.
This is the ability of the Congress to overturn a lot of last-minute Trump regulations with the Congressional Review Act that reconsiders it. They're having to do it carefully, it turns out. Democrats have not forgotten about it, although, they've had an awful lot to do. They've been very, very busy with impeachment, with insurrections, with nominations, all of those things that Mitch McConnell convinced them they would have to be consumed with by not allowing them to be in the beginning of January.
Right.
Anyway, the music's coming in.
Yeah.
They are thinking about it, but there are some issues that they have to consider, and maybe we can talk about that next week.
Okay, We got caught up in a lot of things that are extremely important. That's true. I've got the Politico article that you've share it with me, and I'll share it with everybody there. We can read it as background. Maybe things will have changed a little bit by next week, but I guess there was a conscious decision.
The key thing to remember is that you can't rewrite the new regulations disapproved by Congress if they are substantially the same form. So they have to be very, very careful in what they overturn, because the administration has to be so careful in how they rewrite them.
I see.
In some cases, it might be easier for the Biden administration just to issue new regulations.
And they always do have that option. This was just a shortcut to disapprove of old regulations, but the Biden administration remains free to simply rewrite them as they see fit. It's always a tough process, but no different than the one Trump used. If Trump can do it, I think Biden can figure it out too.
Yeah.
All right. We'll leave it there, and because we have to, because that's what the media says.
NetRootsRadio.com.
I don't know.
All right. Bye.
Okay. Bye, Joan. Thanks very much. We'll talk to you again next week.
David Waldman.
All right. Well, yes, we've come to the end here, and we're up against the time limit. Even though I suppose I don't know what would happen. Would Justice just come over to our house and beat us up if we just went on for another hour, or we recorded a special broadcast later? I don't know. We'll find out next when Justice takes over the mic. We'll see you tomorrow.